Hello, class. Let's finish our discussion of some of these other psychodynamic theorists. So we talked about Freud, we talked about Carl Jung. Now let's move to Alfred Adler. And again, we're going to talk about some of his biography because it's going to give us some insights into his theory. So Adler was born very sickly. He was born the youngest child in his family. And his parents did not like him that much. He started off life as a very poor student. He was not a very good student throughout grade school. But for the last bit of grade school, he decided to bunker down and become a good student. He decided to work very hard, and he ended up rising from the bottom to the top of his class. He really struggled to overcome a lot of his handicaps, his perceived notions of inferiority, and eventually ended up going to medical school to get his medical degree and from then work with Sigmund Freud. Now, we'll notice that for Alfred Adler, a big part of Adlerian psychology is the idea of obtaining power, to overcoming one's inferiority, whether or not real or perceived inferiority. And we can see this in Alfred Adler's life. His parents thought very little of him. He was a poor student, but he dealt with his inferiority. He overcame it and thus became a good student and thus became the man he is, or the man he was. So for all human beings, according to Adlerian theory of personality, it's always about overcoming adversity. It's all about obtaining power and overcoming inferiority. Adler received his MD at the University of Vienna, and he decided to work with Sigmund Freud. And for a while, he was a quite ardent follower of Freud, but eventually he broke away with Freud, especially with Freud's notions of sex and the Oedipus complex. Those are pretty strange. So Adler thought psychoanalysis has a very dirty tint to it. He described it as filth and decided to break away from it and propose his own views. And if we are referring to Adler's views of psychology, we either use the term Adlerian or we refer to it as individual psychology. So if you see individual psychology, it's referring specifically to Adler and his ideas. So Adler contrasted with Freud in many different ways. First and foremost, a lot of the driving forces, according to Freud, are biological. So the notion of sex, the notion of the death instinct, the notion of trying to obtain pleasure, all of that is very biological in nature. However, for Adler, a lot of human behavior is motivated by social forces as opposed to biological forces. In fact, a big part of Adler's theory of personality deals with social interest, which describes humans' innate capacity to interact and cooperate with other people to achieve societal goals. So Adler was constantly talking about social interest and working together as human beings. Adler stressed the importance of conscious as opposed to unconscious forces in personality. So Freud argued that the unconscious plays the big role, or the biggest role, in determining who we are as a person. Adler argued that no, that's not the case. It really is how we consciously deal with a problem. So Adler did not stress the unconscious nearly as much as some of the other psychodynamic theorists did. He really focused on the conscious as opposed to the unconscious elements of the mind. Freud was interested in someone's past and their past experience to determine who they were as a person, their personality, based off of how they dealt with these different developmental stages. For Adler, it's all about someone's hopes and aspirations. Their plans for the future are more likely to determine who they are as a person, their personality. Both Freud and Carl Jung divided the mind into different parts, the ego and the superego for Sigmund Freud, all of these different archetypes according to Carl Jung. Adler emphasized the oneness of the mind, the consistency of personality. And instead of breaking it into all of these different parts that would argue with one another. And the last part that we'll talk about that Freud and Adler differed, Freud believed that women had penis envy, that they have this anxiety and depression because they unconsciously desire to have a penis. Adler argued that there's no biological reason why women should have a sense of inferiority compared to men. So in this aspect, Adler was not sexist, or not extremely sexist compared to Freud. All right. The major driving force for Adler's view of personality is the drive for power. It's the drive for mastery, to feel powerful. An important notion that comes from Adler's view of psychology that we use nowadays is the idea of an inferiority complex. An inferiority complex is an unrealistic feeling of inadequacy, which might be true or it might not be true. It might just be perceived. And because of this inferiority, because someone feels that they're lacking in some ways, they lash out with aggressive behavior, and they try to do something to compensate for this perceived feeling of inferiority. A historic example, or an example that a lot of people like to give, is they like to give that Napoleon Bonaparte was a quote-unquote short man, and because he was short, he has this feeling of inferiority, so he lashes out in a very aggressive way and goes to war with all of Europe. And why does he do this? Because he feels inferior and he has to compensate for this shortness in some way, so he does it by being overly aggressive. Now, Napoleon was of average height for Frenchmen at the time, so that's not exactly true, but we can think of inferiority complex in this sort of way. Maybe someone feels that they're not that smart, so they lash out at people. Maybe they try to compensate for not being that intelligent by constantly talking about that one time on the test they did very, very well. Maybe someone feels inferior, that they're not that manly, so to compensate for this, and when I mean compensate, we're trying to react against our inferiority by asserting power in some way. So maybe if we don't feel that masculine, maybe we dress in a hyper-masculine fashion. Maybe we get a big souped-up truck. Okay, nothing says I'm a man more than a big souped-up truck, right? So this is a way to compensate for our perceived feelings of inferiority. Here's another example that from the internet. Here's a small fish who feels maybe inferior because he's a smaller fish. So how does he compensate for this? Well, he ends up getting a bigger bowl so that he doesn't have to feel that bad about being small. All right. I had a friend all the way through elementary, middle, high school, and he was a shorter guy. He had some problems with his hormones early on in life, so he did not get to be as tall as everybody else. And immediately when he completed high school, he decided to go into the Army. So maybe throughout all of his early life, he felt inferior for being short. A lot of people picked on him because he was short. And so he decided to try to compensate for this and do things that were overly masculine, maybe going to the Army. So if you see this guy now, like he has muscles upon muscles upon muscles, like he is very jacked. He's a shorter guy, again, still, but maybe he's trying to compensate for this by getting overly muscular. I don't know. That would be an Adlerian interpretation of that individual. Ooh, I've got another friend from high school story that I want to talk about. I had a friend, and he was not the most attractive of human beings, right? It's not like he was going to get a date very easily. So what does he do? Well, he decides to convince his parents to give him a Ford Mustang. And whenever we talked to anybody of the opposite sex, that Ford Mustang would be brought up in conversation. So if we were talking to a member of the opposite sex, he would start talking about, well, what are you going to do after school? I'm going to get in my Ford Mustang, and I'm going to go to the Taco Bell and pick up some things, and then I'm going to drive in my Ford Mustang and go to the movie, and then I'm going to drive my Ford. He would mention it like 12 times. Why is he doing this? Maybe because he has some inferiority about something, and maybe one way to compensate for that is by having a nice car. All right, how do you achieve power? How do you overcome inferiority? This is something that Adler cares about. Again, this is a struggle that he had to overcome as a child. And I don't think I mentioned this, but let me go back to it. Adler was quite aware of this, right? Adler noted that those who are familiar with my life work will clearly see the accord existing between the facts of my childhood and the views that I have expressed. Clearly, there is a relationship between what Adler experienced in his early life and the theory that he ended up proposing that all human beings have to encounter. All right. Where was I? Okay. Another important aspect of Adler's theory of psychology, his theory of personality, is that birth order and family constellation matters for personality. Your birth order is a major determinant of your personality, according to Alfred Adler. Now, Adler was a youngest child. He felt that youngest children behave in a certain way, that oldest children behave in a certain way. And based off of your position within a family early on in life, this is going to play a major determining force in how you interact later on in life. So let's think really quickly. What are some of the stereotypes about oldest children, middle children, and youngest children? So according to Adler and according to many people, oldest children are going to be more intellectual. Parents are going to spend more time, energy, and effort into them. They're going to be more hardworking. They're going to be more bossy or socially dominant. They're going to be more likely to direct other people. Again, we'll talk about what truth is in a second, but these are Adler's views. These are some of our stereotypes about oldest children, middle children, and youngest children. How about youngest children? They are the babies of the family, so they might be more creative. They might be more rebellious, and maybe they might be more selfish because the discipline is less strict for youngest children compared to oldest children. I've got a great story about this. I'm an oldest child. As I was growing up, I was not allowed to curse, and my parents would get on to me if ever I said a word I was not supposed to. So I go off to college, and my brother is about 5 years younger than me. So he stays at home, and I come back for Christmas after my first semester of college. And my brother is playing Xbox Live, and he is cussing up a storm. He is saying all kinds of horrible words while my mother and I are sitting and talking about something. And I am looking at my brother, and I'm looking at my mother, and I'm like, ooh, this is going to be bad. She is going to get onto him. She's going to make sure that he regrets saying all these dirty words. But what does she do? She laughs. She finds it hilarious that he says all these bad things. And I am livid. I am very angry. How is it the case that he's able to say these words, but I wasn't? All right. So maybe that has an impact on our personality. Maybe youngest children get away with things that oldest children could not get away with things. Right? How about only children? What is the stereotypes of only children? For Adler, he believed that these children were going to be very selfish and maladjusted. They have nobody to share toys with, right? They don't have anybody that they share attention with for their parents. So they're going to be maladjusted. They're going to have bad personalities, according to Adler. And in fact, when China announced its one-child policy, which is no longer in effect, but was in effect through the 1990s and 2000s, when did it stop? It was in the 2010s. But anyway, so with the one-child policy in China, some people predicted that these children were all going to be very spoiled, that they were going to be maladjusted. There was going to be a huge societal problem because no one had any siblings. How about middle children? What's the stereotype of middle children? Well, Adler did not have as many predictions about middle children, and largely they have been neglected in the psychological research. I'm sorry to mention that to those of you who are middle children, but there's not as many stereotypes. In fact, the stereotype for middle children is that they're often neglected, which unfortunately, according to psychological research, they are kind of neglected. Because psychologists are not studying them, not because they're actually neglected. Sorry about that. All right. So what's the truth? Does birth order matter for personality? The answer is yes, but very slightly. Birth order has a very small determinant on what our personality is going to be. People like to make a big deal out of, are you an only child? Are you the oldest child? And I completely can understand why you behave the way that you do. according to how your family was growing up. It has a small effect on personality, but it doesn't have a negligible effect on personality. So there are some relationships here. So birth order accounts for a very small percentage of the variation in personality. Maybe 4%, maybe less than this. I'm going to show you some of the empirical findings here, but just let you know this is very this is a discipline. These are findings that are very ethereal in nature. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not there. Sometimes people find these findings, sometimes they don't. So for oldest children, they tend to be higher in conscientiousness. They tend to be higher in hardworkingness. They tend to be higher in organization. They also tend to be a little bit higher in neuroticism. And they tend to be more socially dominant. Again, these effects are small. Probably the largest birth order effect is oldest children in conscientiousness. All right, that tends to be the highest relationship between any of these. So in some ways, this is similar to the stereotype, right? Adler's views that they're more dominant, they are maybe more hardworking, more organized, but also a greater degree of anxiety is associated with being an oldest child. All right, youngest children. We see that they are higher in agreeableness. Maybe this is because that they have to mediate some family debates, some family arguments. The youngest child can't physically get into fights because they are smaller. So maybe it's the case that they have to use their words. So maybe they are more agreeable. And there's some evidence to suggest that that's the case. They also might be more reckless. In fact, there's an interesting study that looks at baseball players that are siblings. All right, so professional baseball players, there's an older baseball player and a younger baseball player, and they're siblings. The younger baseball player is more likely to steal bases than the older baseball player, the older sibling. And maybe this sort of shows that younger siblings are more reckless. They're more likely to do things that are increasing, that have an increased risk. How about only children? Are only children maladjusted? Are they spoiled? Are they selfish? Well, as it turns out, we can look at only children versus children that have brothers and sisters, and we see no personality differences between the two groups. So it's not the case that these children are maladjusted, that they're overly selfish, that all children need to have a brother or sister. That is not to have a good personality, right? That it doesn't have to be the case. All right. But again, let me repeat it. I'll repeat it again and again and again. Birth order has a very small relationship with personality. It's existent, but it is not a huge relationship. And middle children are not really studied that much. You need to have at least a 3-person family to have middle children, so it's just harder to find those families to do the research. All right, so not enough research has been conducted with middle children. All right, so let's talk about 2 more psychodynamic theories. We have Karen Horney, and we will talk about object relations theory. Karen Horney, now that's Horney, there's another way to pronounce that, and that way is wrong, and people will look at you funny. All right, Karen Horney, born in Hamburg, Germany. Her father was a ship's captain, and her mother was quite a liberated female. Her mother did not take orders from her father. Her mother only married her father because she did not want to be perceived as an old widow or an old maid. So she told Karen, like, hey, I didn't really want to get married, but society's the way that it is, so I decided to get married. So you would think that since Karen's mother didn't fit the gender stereotype of what a typical mother would be, she would be very accepting of Karen and would want Karen to succeed in life. But that is the opposite of what happened. Karen's father and Karen's mother liked her older brother a whole lot better than her. All right. Her mother rejected her in favor of her firstborn older brother. And Karen Horney envied her brother because she felt that men in society, which was true, were treated differently and treated better than women were. that all the eggs were laid in the son's basket as opposed to the daughter's basket, as I mix my metaphors here. Okay, parents are spending more resources for their sons compared to their daughters. Her father would belittle her, especially about her appearance. He would say that she was a very ugly individual. He would belittle her intelligence, say that she was not very smart. And of course, this is going to have an effect on Karen Horney. The major motivating force for Karen Horney's view of personality is to obtain safety and satisfaction, to have loved ones that care for you, that don't belittle you. So it's not about obtaining power, it's just being safe and being happy with life. And we can see that as the struggles that Karen Horney experienced in her family. So Karen Horney decides to get married, and she has 3 children. She has 3 children with her husband, and she's trying to fill this mother role, but she's very unhappy with this mother role. She doesn't like being a mother. She doesn't like being in this relationship with this one guy, so she cheats on him and with a number of different individuals. For some reason, whenever a biography of Karen Horney is about, whenever a textbook, they always talk about her infidelities. Now, I'm pretty sure that there were infidelities otherwhere with some of these other theorists, but for whatever reason, they really focus on Karen Horney's infidelities. I don't know if that's sexism. I mean, it probably is, but I just want to give you this is what textbooks typically talk about and some of my hesitancies about it. But here's a quote from Karen Horney's journal. "In my imagination, there is no spot on me that has not been kissed by a burning mouth. In my imagination, there is no depravity that I have not tasted to the dregs." So we might refer to her as a very sexually liberated woman. All right, she does not have the Victorian era views of sexuality. So she gets married. She has 3 children. She cheats on her husband. She's not happy with the children. She's not a very good mother. In fact, some of her children seek psychotherapy afterwards because they don't have a very stable family life. She gets an MD, again, similar to all the other psychodynamic theorists. They come from the medical tradition and not from a more research science background. Karen Horney, again, experiences some depression. She doesn't enjoy being in her marriage. She doesn't enjoy being a motherly figure. So she decides to divorce her husband, and she decides to go seek out psychotherapy. And she decides to go see a Freudian psychotherapist. And you can imagine what a Freudian psychologist would say about a Karen Horney, right? So obviously, it has some problem to do with the fact that she's a woman and she envies having a penis. She wants to have this penis. And about that time, Karen Horney got very angry and got mad at that interpretation and argued that Freudian psychoanalysis was not very helpful. So she wanted to create her own theory in response to the very sexist theory of Sigmund Freud. All right, so like Alfred Adler, Karen Horney disagreed with Freud that the majority of motivating forces in personality were biological. For Karen Horney, they are majorly social. The major principles, the major guiding force is the desire to obtain safety and satisfaction. Okay, so to be comfortable with your life, to be happy. Okay, very different than self-discovery, like that of Carl Jung, to obtain power, like Adler, and the pleasure principle of Sigmund Freud, so just safety and satisfaction. According to Karen Horney, everybody as a kid experiences all kinds of trauma from their parents. Doesn't matter who you are, you always experience trauma because of your parents. Now, again, we can see the influence of Karen Horney's own life into her theory of personality. And we repress these feelings of anger and rage that our parents are not doing the best job of taking care of us. And this is referred to as basic hostility in Karen Horney's theory. All right, so we have this basic hostility, this anger that our parents did not take care of our needs as a child. And this eventually leads to basic anxiety, We realize that if our parents are not going to take good care of us, then the world is not a safe place to live in. Nobody else is going to take up for us. So we develop anxiety and feelings of helplessness at being in this world that's out to get us. And this is called basic anxiety, according to Karen Horney's theory. Sometimes we might call this psychoanalytic social theory. That's referring specifically to Karen Horney's views. All right. All human beings, according to Karen Horney, have a variety of neurotic needs. Now, neurotic needs, these are some needs that we have to take care of. Maybe it's a need for achievement. It's a need to feel accomplishment. Maybe it's a need to feel independent from other people. Maybe it's a need to be loved, so all of these different needs human beings have. And human beings have three ways of satisfying these needs. Okay, these are moving towards, moving against, and moving away, according to Karen Horney. Moving towards, if we have some need that we need taken care of, we might move closer to people. If we have a need to feel loved, we might introduce ourselves to people and try to satisfy this need to feel loved. Okay, if we feel helpless, if we feel lonely, we might reach out towards people. Moving towards, extending an olive branch to another human being, trying to get closer to them. This is a good way of taking care of certain neurotic needs. How about if we have a need for power? Well, moving towards is not the best way to take care of that. According to Karen Horney, another strategy is moving against. So maybe getting into an argument with somebody else, maybe exerting your authority. This is a good way to take care of your neurotic need for power. All right, if you are aggressive towards other people, if you put other people down, you might take care of your neurotic need for power. Last one, moving away from other humans to deal with a problem. If you have a need to be independent, well, you have to move away from people that are taking care of you to feel independent. You want to feel self-sufficient, you have to move away from your parents, right? So moving away from a problem is sometimes, or moving away from human beings is sometimes a good way of dealing with a neurotic need. All of these strategies are helpful for dealing with certain neurotic needs. All right, moving towards, gaining friends, being loved, moving against to exert our power, and maybe moving away for independence. Also, there's some situations where moving away is the best alternative. So here's a good example of maybe you're in a relationship that's very bad. And how do you deal with this bad relationship? Well, maybe sometimes moving away, as far as like getting out of that relationship, is the best thing that you can do. All right, for psychologically healthy individuals, they're going to use all of these strategies: moving away, moving against, moving towards. All of those they're going to use to take care of their particular neurotic needs. However, for individuals that are not psychologically healthy, they're going to rely on only one of these methods, or maybe two of these methods. So maybe it's the case that you always move towards individuals. So maybe you are overly clingy in all situations. And sometimes this is not the best way to make friends, not the best way to be loved. So maybe you're overly clingy. You're all constantly moving towards individuals. Maybe if someone's yelling at you, maybe if they're not good for you, but you're constantly trying to attach yourself with them to deal with the problem, that's not going to be a successful solution in all situations. Moving against. Maybe all you're doing is moving against in many situations. This is not the best way of dealing with problems. So if you have a need to be loved, yelling at somebody and punching them in the face is not a good way of expressing that. Okay, it's not a very psychologically healthy, psychologically useful way of dealing with that. All right. And the last one here, moving away. Maybe you have a need to be loved. Maybe to try to deal with that neurotic need, you just leave the situation, and any problem that you encounter, you just vanish. You remove yourself from it. If you do that in all situations, it's not very likely to be psychologically healthy. I hear my dog. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. The dog was barking, so I had to figure out what the problem was. All right, so we talked about moving away, moving towards, moving against being ways to deal with neurotic needs, and how psychologically unhealthy individuals use only one or two of these approaches in all situations. Now, the last term that we want to talk about with Karen Horney is this idea of womb envy. Womb envy, it's hard to know how much of this is true and how much of this is just trolling Sigmund Freud and his followers. So remember, Freud has this idea that women experience anxiety and depression because they desire to have a penis. Karen Horney decides to flip this on its head, and that men experience what's known as womb envy. Men experience anxiety because they cannot become pregnant, that they cannot nurse a baby. There's plenty of things that women can do that men cannot when bringing a life into this world, and men feel anxiety and feel anxiety because of that, and that's this womb envy. And part of the evidence for this is the fact that men wear lots of things that have lots of pockets on them. Okay, so men wear shirts with pockets, they wear pants with actual functioning pockets compared to some of the pockets that women wear. So why do men have all of these pockets to have all of these things? Well, it's because they unconsciously desire to have a uterus, according to Karen Horney. And that's the reason that they always wear pockets. So it's kind of a weird idea. Like I said, I don't know how truthful or serious Karen Horney was being with the positing this particular idea, or if it's just kind of, well, this is a dumb idea. I can do the same thing with it for guys compared to girls, like what Freud did. Okay, so that's Karen Horney and some of her ideas about personality. So let's look at the most modern conceptualization of a psychodynamic theory in object relations theory. And this is something that has become popular in the past 30 or so years. A very different time frame than all the other theorists that were doing their work in the early 1900s. All right, so the difference between object relations theorist or theory and the other ones is it's not associated with a single psychologist. So there's plenty of people that have proposed object relations theory and has made contributions to it. So names like Melanie Klein, Margaret Mailer, Heinz Kohert, Winnicott, a number of different individuals. So there's multiple theorists instead of just one. So while Sigmund Freud emphasized the first 4 to 6 years of life in determining what your personality was going to be, according to object relations theorists, the critical period is even earlier than that. It's the first 4 to 6 months of life. The important elements of your personality have to do with the attachment between the baby and their primary caregiver, most of the time their mother. All right, so object relations theorists place less of an emphasis on biological drives. Object relations theorists emphasize biological drives less, like what Freud did, and they emphasize the social element of things. According to object relations theorists, the most important thing that an infant can do is internalize a positive mother object. All right, babies are going to internalize, they're going to take some object in the outside world and internalize that object so that they're going to have it throughout the rest of their lives. So a baby is going to internalize their mother. So if their mother acts in a good way and is always nurturing and caring, then they're going to internalize that motherly figure. If their mother is very neglectful, not doing a very good job at parenting, they're going to internalize that harsh and uncaring mother. All right, and throughout the rest of an infant's life, rest of this kid's life, rest of human beings' life, they're going to have this internalized figure of their mother that's going to help them or hurt them in certain situations. For instance, if you are doing well on a test, you're doing succeeding, well, maybe your internalized mother says, you know, good job, you should feel good about yourself. If you do poorly on the test, they say, well, maybe it's the case that you'll do better next time. Compared to a very negative internalization of a mother, they are going to constantly belittle you if you get something wrong. All right, so it's very important that we internalize a positive mother. All right. So if things go well between the mother and the infant's going to internalize a caring, nurturing, and trustworthy mother object. And all of their future relationships are going to be based off of this relationship between the infant and their mother. So they're going to have successful romantic relationships. They're going to have successful friendships if they internalize a positive mother figure, mother object. However, if the parenting doesn't go that well, the child might internalize an uncaring mother that's deceitful, that doesn't take care of them. An example I have of this is the movie Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which if you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. I'm going to spoil the ending, but I think it was released in 1960. So if you haven't seen it by now, I don't know what to say. But in the movie, Norman Bates is seen constantly talking to somebody. We don't know what it is, but we think it's his mother. And she's telling him to, kill people, and she's constantly belittling him in some way. And Norman goes about and kills people at the Bates Motel. At the end of the movie, we find out that Norman was not talking to his mother, that he was talking to his mother's corpse, and that the conversations that he had were all in his head. So maybe Norman Bates has internalized a negative mother figure, and this is leading to all of the negative things that he does in his life, the reason why he can't have a normal relationship with anybody. All right, so how the infant internalizes their mother will affect all subsequent relationships. All right. A lot of different theories that we talked about, a lot of differences between these theories. To help you study a little bit, I've created this lovely graphic table. There we go. A lovely table here that might help you in distinguishing some of the differences and the similarities between some of these theories. All right. These are only some of the things that I want you to know, so make sure that you are going through and looking at all the similarities and differences. All right. So we will end this lecture here, and we will wrap things up with, so what? What are some criticisms of psychodynamic theories? Is there anything useful from them? If so, what usefulness can we glean from these theories? All right, have a wonderful day, and I'll talk with you later.